Should the federal or state governments make hate speech illegal? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Hey, Richard, you got to do your drinking at night, not during the day, please.
Well, what do you mean by that? I don't know.
All right. Well, so thank you for tuning in. And if you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org for, 33 years of principled arguments on liberty, and our YouTube channel, Facebook, Twitter. Richard, you sent me a very interesting article this week by Jonathan Turley. He's a professor of law at George Washington University. I have the utmost respect for Turley. In fact, he spoke at one of our conferences many years ago on civil liberties in the national security state. And you can see that the video of that presentation on our website at fff.org. But the article you sent me dealt with freedom of speech. And Turley's thesis is that, look, there's people that are rightly concerned about hate speech. It's not something that's really the most admirable thing in the world. But the problem is that there's all too many people that want to make it illegal. They want to punish people. They want the state to punish people who engage in hate speech. And Turley's thesis is, wait a minute, we got a great big obstacle here, and that's the First Amendment. The First Amendment makes it very clear that Congress shall enact no law that abridging the freedom of speech. And of course, that restriction applies to the states by virtue of the 14th Amendment. So I thought, well, let's discuss this, Richard. I think it's been quite a while since we've discussed the First Amendment. And, many years ago when I was a young attorney, this was before I discovered libertarianism. I'd just gotten out of law school. I was practicing law. And I decided that I wanted to join the ACLU. And one of the reasons that I really admired the ACLU is what the position they had taken in Skokie, Illinois. And that was an incident where a bunch of Nazis wanted to march in Skokie with an organized parade. And the city officials said, no, this is very hateful things, that you're a Nazi and we're not going to let you. And the ACLU took on their case and fought it, and they lost tons of donations for it. I mean, they were just widely criticized. How can you dare defend Nazis? I thought you were a good organization. Well, that's what motivated me to join them, or at least to be really interested in them. I can't remember exactly when I joined them, but I ultimately became the ACLU representative in my hometown of Laredo, where I was practicing law. And I deeply admired them for that position, even though they were losing a lot of donations, because they understood that the right of free speech doesn't involve the right to say things that are popular or say things that are widely accepted. The right of free speech is the right to say the things that are despicable, that people hate, that they don't want you to say. I mean, if you look, for example, in communist China or North Korea, Cuba, people there are free to say whatever they want, as long as it's responsible. And that's the catch, that the speech has to be responsible, that as soon as they go outside the bounds of responsibility, the state comes crashing down on them. Well, that means that true freedom of speech is the right to say what's irresponsible, to say what's despicable. And that's where hate speech falls into this category, that sure, it's not something that somebody like you or me might praise. Hey, man, you guys are saying some really nasty things about Jews or Catholics or gays or transgenders or whatever, but you got a right to say them. And that if we don't stand up for the people that are saying the things that are not popular, then freedom of speech is really in danger all across the board. What do you think?
Well, I think that you're absolutely right, but we need to also remember that this isn't the first time we've faced this issue in American history. For at least 3 decades before the American Civil War, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, there was a concerted attempt to restrict or even prohibit freedom of speech in various parts of the country. And that was by the attempt of Southerners and who advocated slavery, or their sympathizers in the North or in the unorganized territories in the West, that to advocate abolition, to call for the end of slavery, to assert that blacks were equal to whites because we are all children in the same equal children in the eyes of God, was against the national interest, a threat to social cohesion, a denial of the sanctity of private property. The slave owner has a right to a person as much as into an inanimate object, and that they must be prohibited at the state level, and if necessary, to go to the Congress to have this, to restrict, prohibit the advocacy of abolition, because this is a threat. It is hateful speech. It is hateful against the South. It is hateful against the slave owners. It is against the traditions of the South. It is a threat to the cohesion of the Union. These people went to the point that mobs or local governments would seize and destroy printing presses. They would brutalize people. They would kill people for wanting to publish pamphlets and advocating abolition, and all because they viewed this as hateful and harmful speech. So unfortunately, this is nothing new in American history. Fast forward to the First World War. Woodrow Wilson declares war, has Congress declare war in April of 1917, and immediately censorship laws are imposed, restrictions on freedom of speech. It is a threat to the society to challenge and question Americans' participation in the war, to express doubts about the virtuousness of making the world safe for democracy, with only the president of the United States can lead the country to do. So unfortunately, these episodes are not unique. This recent episode is not unique. We've had these episodes in American history in which the state has done it, mobs have attempted to do it, individuals wishing to have freedom of the press and freedom of speech have been brutalized and even attacked. Members of Congress have been attacked on the floor of the Senate for speaking their minds in the past, in the pre-Civil War days. So this is nothing new. But what is it? While most people would say today, it's outrageous, it's outrageous. What, to advocate the end of slavery is hate speech? Well, you know, the problem is at that time it was controversial. What is hate speech? What is fake news? What do you mean isn't it fake news to claim that the Constitution doesn't respect slavery? What do you mean it's fake news? It's fake news to say that some people, merely because of the color of their skin, are equal to me and another person who's of a different color. So these things have gone through our history, and we cannot allow it to stand. The thing is that it is always easy to have the freedom to say yes. Yes, Mr. President. Yes, Mr. Prime Minister. Yes, Mr. Dictator. Yes, Mr. Emperor King. The importance is having the freedom to say no, both in one's actions and in one's words. To say, I disagree, I dissent, I think you're wrong, we're moving in a wrong direction. I think a better set of principles, ideas, policies for the country, for a community, for my fellow citizens is X. And even if you find my arguments outrageous, if you find the words in which I express them to be extreme and unpopular, and even if you think I am a sinner going to hell, a free society must secure this, because as John Stuart Mill said in his famous essay on liberty, which one of us can ever claim to have enough knowledge, wisdom, and insight to assure that we know the absolute truth? Even someone who seems despicable to us in what he thinks and says may in fact, in a calmer sense, be found to have spoken truth, or at least part of the truth. And it is only by allowing this conflict of ideas, these battles over what is right, what is wrong, what seems reasonable, and what should be done peacefully. Unless this is done, a healthy, a growing, and a peaceful and a harmonious society is impossible. The importance of the First Amendment is not to assure that people can say what others like, but to guarantee that they have the protection of saying things that others disagree with, even repugnantly, because we never know whether that hammer could come down on you next time instead of the fellow with whom you disagree.
Yeah, your point about this shouldn't surprise us is a good one, because I mean, why is there even a First Amendment when the delegates at the Constitutional Convention met? It was with the purpose of just modifying the Articles of Confederation, and then instead they came out with a completely different type of governmental structure called a limited government republic. And the idea was that if government's powers were enumerated in the Constitution, and that if a power wasn't enumerated, then it couldn't be exercised. Well, there wasn't any power to infringe on freedom of speech, so the argument was the government isn't given that power. Well, the American people accepted the deal. They were very leery about it, but because it was much more powerful, the federal government was, than it was under the Articles of Confederation, but only on the condition that a Bill of Rights be enacted. Now, why would they need a Bill of Rights? Because freedom of speech, the infringement of freedom of speech, is not listed as a power. So why do you need a restriction? Well, because they understood the nature of political power. They knew that inevitably political power would attract the kind of people who would want to punish people for what they were saying. And they said, we're going to put it in black and white. And we're going to have a First Amendment that says, even though you are democratically elected members of Congress or Mr. President, you cannot infringe freedom of speech. And the reason they saw fit to do that was because they knew that at some point the members of Congress would do that, or the president would do that. And they wanted to make it clear they didn't trust these people, and with some justification, as we've seen. And as you point out, it goes back to before the Civil War. World War I is a classic example. I mean, I'm always amused that today they criticize Putin for punishing and jailing people who are criticizing his war in Ukraine, but really he's just taken a page out of the playbook of the U.S. government in World War I, because what Wilson was doing was no different from what Putin's doing. He was jailing people for daring to question the draft, to question the war. I mean, this is just classic infringements of freedom of speech. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court was upholding a lot of what he was doing. The other thing that I'd like to point out is it's important that we understand the distinction between the private sector and the government sector. The First Amendment does not operate as a restriction on the private sector. It only operates as a restriction on the governmental sector. So that the government cannot enact a law or take a measure that infringes freedom of speech. But private institutions are free to do that whenever they want, as long as they're not initiating force against someone. But if a private company, for example, says to its employees, you cannot criticize Catholics here during work hours, that's its right, because it owns the business. It's not a violation of the employee's freedom of speech. Or if I go to a radio station and I say, I want the time to advocate libertarian principles on your radio station, and they say no, they're not violating my right of free speech, because it's their radio station. If I want to go establish my own radio station, I'm free to do that. Now, there's been instances where you've got private companies that are being bludgeoned, pressured by the federal government, as we've seen with Twitter and other private institutions. But the real harm that's taking place there is that the government is there infringing on the rights of Twitter or private companies. And that's what we've got to focus on. But otherwise, the private sector is free to say what they want and to establish their own rules of conduct in their homes and in their businesses. No infringement on freedom of speech whatsoever.
I think that distinction is very important. And it touches upon a variety of things going on right now. There are many conservatives, and no doubt in the philosophical sense of being irritated with the ideas of libertarians who find these large social media companies and outlets saying that that they have to restrict hate speech or harmful speech or socially divisive speech. And people are upset that, well, how dare they censor? How dare they do this and that? But the fact is private companies, they have an absolute right to do so. They're advocating ideas that I don't share, I think are dangerous in the sense I think they're taking, if applied further politically down the road, taking the country in wrong directions. But the fact is, as a private enterprise, as a private company, corporation, or a single proprietorship, the owner or owners of those companies or corporations have absolute authority to manage their private property. As long as they don't resort to violence or theft or fraud, they have a right to manage their property in any way, shape, or form that they find most advantageous or profitable, or some other goal that they might have in mind. So if a Google or a Facebook or any of these wish to say, no, we don't want to allow these kind of people to be using our platform at all, or to say these things, then they have the absolute right to do so. What you do is that, as you were suggesting, if you find this censorious in the private sense, in the non-government sense, that this person is trying to prevent you from expressing your ideas through their private platform, then the answer to that is to find platforms either outside of their ambit of control and determination, or to form a consortium of others to do so. That will not be as restricted or will be competitive. I mean, a lot of people came to hate CNN. Well, what happened then? Fox News came along. And I'm not defending everything that says on Fox News. I'm talking about the competitive aspect of the private sector here. And there are people who don't like Fox News for a variety of things they do. And there have been other conservative or libertarian outlets that have arisen to express different views. Now, let's just take the Future of Freedom Foundation. You've probably heard of this organization, Jacob. There are other libertarian and classical liberal oriented organizations that may share some common values and beliefs and principles, but they don't necessarily always apply them or see the logic or see the application of them in particular ways in the way that you or I do. So we are, rather than being, oh, Cato doesn't express our view, or Heritage doesn't express our view, or this organization, or the Peterson Foundation, or whatever organization doesn't espouse our point of view. You find those who share your values and beliefs, pool your resources, in this case, the generosity of people who value the kind of ideas FFF does, and you have your own outlet as expressed in this type of YouTube or video series that we do regularly. That is both the principled and the sound way to pursue these things, not to turn to government to shut things down or force people to say or do things of which you disapprove. In Ludwig von Mises's great little book on classical liberalism that originally came out in German in 1927, he says that it's very difficult for the free person to resist the temptation to turn to the policeman whenever someone does or says something that they don't like, but that a true enlightened individual has to accept the fact that others in society will do things and say things that they disapprove of or disagree with, but the acceptance of it is a mark of an enlightened human being.
Yeah, you make some good points there. That when the private sector is doing something, that's just the private sector decision. People may disagree with it. When you and I were talking a few weeks ago about antitrust laws, we were saying that as long as there's freedom of entry in the free market, there's no problem. If a company gets very large and it's not satisfying customers, they'll go elsewhere. But if you get a monopoly, a legal monopoly, where the government's enacting a law that says you can't compete against this, like with the Postal Service, well, then you're just stuck with it. But as long as there's freedom of entry, and that the customer is sovereign. I mean, he ultimately decides whether he's going to patronize Twitter or some competitor to Twitter, or YouTube or some competitor to YouTube. And the consumer can oftentimes nudge a company into a different behavior because they're so scared of losing market share and money. The another thing, though, Richard, that we have to discuss in this area is government institutions and government supported institutions like colleges and universities or public schools at the local level, that you get into all these endless debates as to what a college can do and what can its policies be with respect to its students and its professors. And there really isn't a hard, fast answer here. I mean, the dispute inevitably gets politicized. If you take, for example, the school where you were the Ludwig von Mises professor for many years of economics, Hillsdale College, they are totally private. They take no government funds. They will not let their students take government grants. So they're totally independent of any government control. So anything that Hillsdale does in terms of speech, you may disagree with it, but there's nothing the government can do about it because they are totally independent. They call the shots. If they say on our campus, you will not say this or that, that's the way it's going to be. And if students don't like it, they need to just go elsewhere. That it's the school's right to set those determinants. In a state-supported college, all that becomes muddy and fuzzy, because how do you resolve these disputes? If a college says, well, we don't want professors to be criticizing Russia or the United States government in this conflict or whatever, all of a sudden you've got free speech violations because now it's the state doing it, or a state-supported school, or at the public school level, it's the state doing these things. How do you resolve these? There really is no way to resolve this. Whatever resolution comes about is entirely arbitrary, and there's inevitably going to be people that are upset. In a true free market, private property order, people would choose the schools or the educational vehicles that met with their values, their policies that they liked, and this would work at the college level and at the local level, the secondary schools and so forth, that the customers would make these decisions rather than have them politicized in some arbitrary way by a school board or by the state legislature at the college or university level.
Well, this obviously has been very controversial in this context in the last several years, actually decade now. And that is, shall high schools or even grammar schools have the authority in terms of curriculum to offer courses or to impose courses or include in the teaching critical race theory? Now, this has become a burning issue with public schools, college academics, and college setting. Those people who've read some of my articles over the years, either through FFF as an outlet or some other places, know that I've been very critical of this particular term of analyzing race relations. It's theory, the circumstances, the reality. I consider most of this merely being variations on the Marxian class conflict theme, but turned on the basis of race and gender, and therefore is both equally logically incorrect, factually in error, and dangerous as a policy perspective. But it's one thing to see that these are dangers, and another thing to think that you should determine and dictate this will or will not be there in a state system of education. The problem is that as long as the government has control over an outlet like education, it's an either-or situation. Either this is the curriculum or that is the curriculum, and it's imposed on everyone in school because you have mandatory attendance laws within the district in which you're located for your children. The only way to do this and to eliminate this tension on issues like this, what is my freedom of speech to teach or to express inside and outside the classroom, whether it be to a 12-year-old or to a 20-year-old in a college class, is basically to separate education from the state, to privatize it. And then you may not support a school or a college that has this curriculum. The school or college that hires and has a certain people teaching these types of ideas, then you don't pay that tuition. You don't send your son or daughter there. You don't attend there yourself. But once you introduce the state, everything becomes, as you were saying, clouded and muddy, because who has the authority and what ideas are considered legitimate, which is not. That is why it is so necessary to depoliticize to denationalize as much of human affairs as is possible in any way, shape, and form from the arm of government.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, I want to bring up another aspect of this that's been part of our lives for the past 3 years or so, and that's relating to COVID. I mean, there's been heated debates with respect to whether people should wear masks, whether they should get vaccinated, whether they should stay 6 feet apart from each other. And I mean, there's been, people on both sides of the issue saying, well, masks are bad, and others say masks are good, and you shouldn't get vaccinated. Yes, you should get vaccinated. Well, this is all part of free speech. And if a private company doesn't want people to advocate a particular view, that's its right, as we've been discussing here. So if it believes that somebody is coming along saying, well, you don't need to use vaccines, that you're going to be fine, and they consider that a quack theory, they have a right not to present that on their television show or their internet show or whatever. What can't happen is for the government to enact a law trying to shut one side or the other down. That's the violation of free speech. The violation of free speech doesn't take place because people in the private sector are taking positions one way or the other. And the libertarian position is that people should simply be free to say what they want with respect to these positions, even if the other side considers them totally quack theories. And you also have a right to wear a mask or not wear a mask, patronize businesses that have mask requirements or don't have mask requirements. There's nothing about libertarianism that is pro-mask or anti-mask or pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine. Libertarianism is simply about freedom, that each person has the right to make these choices on his own and to express his views on his own, keep the state out of it. In other words, separate healthcare in the state, just like you were talking about separating school and state.
Yeah, a couple of years ago when it was far more mandatory to wear these masks, a fellow was arrested by the police while trying to rob a bank. His crime, he was trying to rob the bank without a mask on.
That's disgusting, Richard. Don't give up your day job, Richard, please. You ought to go on stage. There's one leaving tomorrow.
You're disgusting.
All right. On that fine, insightful, intelligent, intellectual comment, we will wrap things up for today. Thank you all for tuning in. As always, appreciate your support of FFF. Come and visit us, as I said earlier, for 33 years of principled arguments on liberty. Our YouTube site, our Twitter page, Facebook. And Richard, as always, I greatly enjoyed the conversation. Look forward to talking to you next week.
Take care.
Okay, that's a wrap. Let me see if I can stop recording here. Yeah, stop.